Hello, good people of YouTube. Mountbatten here. And today we have some most intriguing news to go over. You see, the Russian submarines that were originally announced in 2022 and then subsequently never mentioned again outside of the one Tier 8 premium that we got, they are finally apparently coming out this year, well, this coming year, and they are going through some pretty major changes. Now, there's a good chance that a lot of you guys here didn't even know that these submarines were announced. They were back in 2022, and they were supposed to be a line of anti-submarine submarines. So they were originally pitched as submarine hunters, if you will, which was a pretty interesting idea. They had an excellent submarine surveillance consumable. I believe it had a longer duration time than your run-of-the-mill sub-surveillance consumable back then, and I believe their homing torpedoes were quite good at closer ranges, but that's all changing. So let's go ahead and look at this DevBlog. Link to this DevBlog will be in the description down below. I will read through it, and any images or artwork that needs to be thrust upon screen, I will do so, but if you want to read along as I read aloud, check out the link down below. So this devblog is titled Closed Testing 14.0 Changes to Test Ships, and it starts. In 2022, we announced a closed test of a new branch, Soviet submarines. Now we plan to introduce these ships to the game next year, so 2025, updating them with a fresh concept to carve out an interesting and distinct role in the current gameplay landscape. The original design leaned too closely to other available playstyles in submarines, lacking unique traits apart from their exceptional submarine surveillance consumable. The new concept repositions these submarines closer to destroyers in playstyle, emphasizing the use of unguided alternative torpedoes from longer distances. To support this adjustment, we're improving the damage of the alternative torpedoes while nerfing both the speed and range of the homing torps. These changes encourage players to focus on alternative torpedoes as their primary damage-dealing weapon. Additionally, these ships retain standout characteristics such as the decent surface speed and best-in-class range for their submarine surveillance, which further complements this new playstyle. A reduction in dive capacity and enhancements to acceleration parameters align these submarines with a surface-focused playstyle. Players will find the Soviet submarines better suited for operating above water, diving only under pressure or in specific tactical situations. So, basically what they do with they only go over the L20, which is the Tier 8 sub, and the K1, which is the Tier 10 sub. What they do is they increase the reload time for their sonar. So the researchable sonar for like the L20, the base reload time was 6.5. Now it's been increased to 15 seconds, and they've increased the velocity for the ping. Pretty much the same thing happens between the L20 and the K1, just, at like a Tier 10 scale with like the ranges and such. But anyway, the torpedoes on the L20, the bow loaders have been increased from 2 to 3. Stern loaders increased from 1 to 2. That's the amount of loaders that are loading the torpedoes tubes individually. The acoustic torpedoes on the L20, the arming distance was increased from 290 to 400 meters. The speed was reduced from 75 to 68 knots, and the detectability range has been reduced from 2.0 to 1.7 kilometers. The alternative torpedoes, their arming distance was also increased to 400 meters, but their speed was increased from 69 to 73 knots, and the damage was increased from 13,467 to 15,500. And that's pretty much what happens across the board. But they do also adjust the dive capacity as well. The capacity for the L20 was reduced from 250 to 210 units. The recharge rate was increased from 0.8 to 1.5 units. And the ascent and descent speed has been reduced from 3.1 to 2.4 meters a second. And again, the acceleration parameters were improved. And the detectability on the surface for the L20 was increased from 6 to 6.2 kilometers. The submarine surveillance consumable, the action time was increased from 25 to 40 seconds. The cooldown time is now 100 seconds instead of 80 seconds. The preparation time was reduced from 290 to 285 seconds. That's that awkward period at the start of the match where you can't use the submarine surveillance consumable just yet. The damage con, like they mentioned, it was changed to the fast damage con, where the action time is now 5 seconds, Cooldown time is 45 seconds. You get 4 charges of that base. The K1, which is the tier 10. Similar things happened here. The sonar reload times increased from 6 to 15 seconds. Range reduced from 10 to 9 kilometers. And the velocity of the ping was increased from 600 to 800 meters a second. The torpedo armaments, again, the acoustic torpedoes, basically they got nerfed. Range was reduced from 10 to 9 kilometers. The arming distance increased from 270 to 400 meters. Speed reduced 78 to 70 knots. And then the range was reduced from 2.1 to 2 kilometers for their detection. And then the unguided torpedoes were buffed. Again, their arming range was increased to 400 meters. The speed has been increased to 75 from 72 knots. The damage was increased from 14,600 to 16,800 damage. Okay. And again, very similar things with the dive capacity. Basically, yeah, it can stay underwater for shorter amounts of time. But the speed underwater was also nerfed from 18 to 16 knots. And again, similar changes. The ascent and descent speed was reduced. The detectability was nerfed from 6.1 to 6.3 kilometers. And again, similar things with submarine surveillance. I believe it's actually, is it the same? Okay, no, it's actually slightly different, so I'll go over that. The action time was increased from 30 to 40 seconds on the K1, and the cooldown time was increased from 60 to 90 seconds, and the detection range of the submarine surveillance was decreased from 10 to 9 kilometers, and again, it got the fast damage con. So, the Soviet subs. There is a tier 6 sub. They don't have the stats out in this devblog. They note that it will be out in the next devblog, or the next time they mention these guys in the devblog. So, Soviet subs. You know what this sounds like now? This sounds an awfully lot like the I-56. This is literally how the I-56 is played. The I-56 is a terrible submarine. It is a very nice torpedo destroyer, though, because it has a terrible underwater speed. It has a very small amount of dive capacity. It's got 2 minutes of dive capacity. By the time you actually get down there, you've probably burned through like 20 seconds of it. So it can stay underwater for maybe a minute and 40 seconds. 2 minutes and change if you use the reserve battery. But the I-56 isn't really a good ship at all, because of all the changes that have come to submarines, especially the arming nerf, which these guys are of course getting as well. For the first 3 kilometers of the distance your torpedo travels, it can only do 10% of its maximum damage. And then from 2.9 to 3 kilometers, it increases up to 100%. So, like, if you hit them at, like, 2.95 kilometers, it still only does 50% of the damage. You have to get that full 3 kilometers for the torpedo to do its maximum amount of damage. And, of course, they did this to stop shotgunning. So, while it did do that, now the I-56 is kind of really rough to use. You might be thinking, well, Sealord, I mean, if you were just shotgunning with the I-56, that was really annoying. Well, 3 kilometers, it doesn't sound like a lot when you say it out loud, but it's a lot in game. Because what most would typically do with the I-56 is you would get close to a combat zone, you would go down to periscope depth, and then you would throw your torpedoes at ships from like 4-ish kilometers away, which is close but isn't shotgunning. And you would catch them. They're coming around the corner of islands, or if they were in the middle of a brawl with somebody else, you would chunk your torpedoes in there, and that's kind of how the I-56 worked. But now that you have this 3 kilometer arming threshold, well, think about it. If a tier 8 plus ship, because the I-56 is a tier 8, is coming towards you, even if they're 6 kilometers away, there's a very good chance that it can close that 3 kilometer gap before your torpedoes get out of that 3 kilometer arming zone. There's a very real chance of that, especially if it's one of the faster battleships or battle cruisers, or definitely if it is a cruiser. That's just kind of oof, right? Now, of course, the I-56 has the funny deck gun, which if you catch somebody lacking, you can definitely get them with that. But yeah, that's what this sounds like now, and that doesn't really lead me to believe that these are going to be any good. Now, of course, a very large portion of you are going, great, that's fantastic. We don't want good submarines in the game because we find them annoying as hell, which, in my opinion, they are annoying, but, man, like, go drive one right now and see what it's like to play. They're not a lot of fun to play. They're very difficult to use. You don't really get a whole lot of damage with them. Because of all the changes and such. It's just a rough time for submarines right now, which again, I'm sure many of you are, rejoicing at that, right? But I don't know if this is kind of the right direction to go with them. Granted, of course, with the 3-kilometer arming range, that has kind of murdered all submarine violence, right? Well, all sub-on-sub violence, right? Because that was well within what submarines were duking it out at. Most submarines, you run into them at 2 kilometers, then you start having a fist fight underwater. And I thought that was one of the funner aspects of submarine gameplay. Trying to get your torpedo tubes around and trying to get your torps to home in on them while you're trying to dodge their torpedoes. So you're increasing your depth and decreasing your depth and doing these hard turns. I thought that was a ton of fun, and that was one of the funnest aspects of playing a sub. But unfortunately, because of course the shotgunning that had to be nerfed, so that's kind of sad. And if the Soviet subs were going to be that anti-submarine line, that was a pretty cool idea in my opinion. But again, sadly, it's not really looking like that's going to be a thing anymore. I mean, of course, this is just a concept change, and they may somehow swap it back. But again, from 3 kilometers, submarines are more maneuverable now than they were when this line was announced 2 friggin' years ago. So I don't really think that's going to be feasible unless they give them these torpedoes that are super maneuverable and do a very low amount of damage, intending them to do damage to submarines. So yeah, it's very odd because I believe they mentioned that they were working on, and don't quote me on this, but I distinctly remember reading this. They didn't have the ships out yet, but they mentioned that they were doing this with a Japanese submarine line as well. I think it was in, I cannot remember the DevBlog. It was, again, like 2 years ago. We've had so many more DevBlogs since then. But they mentioned that they were trying this idea with Japanese submarines as well, where they were going to be these quote-unquote cruiser submarines like the I-56 that are big, have a lot of HP, they mainly operate on the surface, and they have a controllable deck gun. And they were, again, supposed to be like the I-56, so, they primarily used the unguided torpedoes with, a fast reload time on the torpedo tubes. But, yeah, they've never manifested. Maybe they're taking, like, the Soviet submarines and that part of the Japanese submarines, kind of meshing them together for the second round of Soviet submarines. But, yeah, nothing else has come out about those guys either. And I know a lot of you probably go, well, great, more submarines in the game. Well, I mean, like, this is the first new line since the British submarines, and that was so long ago, right? That was, what, last end of 2023, beginning of 2024, is when we got our last submarine line. So it's been a minute, and this is the first new round of subs we got in the game in a very long time. So at least they aren't pumping them out like they are every other class in the game, right? So you can take a little bit of solace in that, but it doesn't sound like they're going to be good in my opinion from what I'm reading here. If you are a submarine commander, let me know what you guys think about these subs in the comments down below. They don't sound too hot, but who knows? Again, this is just the initial changes being announced. We'll see what comes of them. So it seems to be that they do specifically mention that they are planning on bringing these guys out next year. So this is likely going to be the next tech line after what? The Dutch light cruisers are next? So maybe these guys are after them? I don't think anything else has been announced as of just yet. I might have missed it, but I don't think so. So yeah, I think this is going to be our second line of 2025. So let me know what you guys think about that in the comments down below. Hope you guys have a wonderful Friday, and hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.